All right, we're going to finish up our section on evolution by talking about how new species form. So we're going to talk about species, speciation, gene pools, reproductive isolation, particularly geographic isolation, and then gene flow and genetic drift. All right, so we want to kind of describe how new species form, discuss evidence of rapid and evolutionary change over time. And so remember, evolution is just genetic change in a population of organisms, such that helpful uh, variations have a tendency to accumulate, and variations that are bad tend to disappear. So this can lead to new adaptations and new species. The way this happens is by natural selection. Some individuals that have particularly good genetic varieties. Those do better in the environment and they leave more offspring, survive more and leave more offspring, and that's how things change. There's lots of evidence of um, evolution and natural selection. This is among the strongest evidence that Darwin presented, and he talked a lot about artificial selection. We knew from animal and plant breeding for agriculture and just for hobbyists that humans could select the traits of the animals and control their reproduction and get change. And I say animals, and I have a picture of dog breeds because it's really obvious change, but this was also true of plants. Um, Plant breeders produce new varieties just as often as animal breeders do. They produce new varieties of corn and wheat. um, we can probably see it best when we go to stores and buy flowers like roses. There's new varieties coming out all the time. So they just select the things they want and breed them and control the breeding. We also see evidence of evolution in the fossil record, that there's been lots of change over time, that the farther back you go into older and older sediments, the less they look like modern animals. Um, they farther and farther back till you get old enough fossils where all it is bacteria. And then later on, you start getting some marine animals and eventually land plants and then vertebrates. And so, in addition, we get some fossil intermediates, things that don't look like any organisms alive today. Here's an example of an animal that looks like a half bird and half reptile. So when we talk about evolution, one of the big things is, can we really see new species form? And before we think about that, we have to think of what is a species. Um, we a species like the white oak, we all know it has a certain leaf shape. It has acorns. The tree has a certain shape, and we give it a scientific name. But not all white oaks look the same. So what is a species? And it has to do with interbreeding populations, that these organisms, the oaks, can produce offspring with other oaks, but not oaks that are not white oaks. Only white oaks can interbreed with white oaks. And so they're reproductively isolated from other such groups, and they all share a gene pool. So uh, these are the definition of a species is groups of potentially interbreeding natural populations that are isolated. The population members can interbreed with one another and produce offspring that are fertile, and they don't mate with individuals from other groups, or if they do, they don't produce fertile offspring. Okay. Sometimes there's differences between in different areas. We sometimes say a subspecies may be kind of distinct in one area, but even though they may look distinct, they potentially interbreed with intervening individuals, and there might be a gradient so that we can recognize these individuals, but they're just forming a gradient. So how fast does evolution occur and how do new species develop? Well, the I'll leave the rate question for a little bit, but the key thing is reproductive isolation, so that members of of a certain group can't breed with other members. So I have a picture of a geek here, but there's lots of ways reproductive isolation can develop. Probably the most common way is through geographic isolation. So a number of individuals get isolated maybe on an island surrounded by water, or maybe in a patch of habitat surrounded by different kinds of habitats. But that's pretty typical, is geographic isolation. We think it's the most important thing, and that's why Darwin and Wallace both noticed islands have unusual species. But there's other things for animals, their behavior, or for animals and plants, their ecology, or when their breeding period is, or the kind of specifics of mating and fertilization, that can separate individuals. And sometimes you do get hybrids forming between different populations, but if they're infertile, then it doesn't matter that much. So species in geographic isolation, that's usually a two-part process. We think it's extremely common. Um, that this process, initially the populations become separate, and then they start diverging. And eventually when they get different enough so that they can no longer breed together, that's when they're species. Okay. Unfortunately, if there's migration between that isolated population and the larger population, that can erase differences and prevent that. But sometimes even when there's gene flow, you get different species. And so a good example is that coconut palms occur throughout the world in tropical and subtropical areas, okay, that they are geographically isolated, but their seeds, the coconut, is really designed to float long distances. But even then, that gene flow may not be enough to prevent new species from developing on islands. And so I think we all know what coconuts look like in stores. They're single balls, but not these. These are the Seychelles Island coconuts. It's a separate species. And to me, it looks, well, kind of strange. I won't say what it looks like, but it definitely doesn't look like a regular coconut. And so there's obviously not enough gene flow there. Um, in animals, we see lots of behavioral isolation, like birds might sing or dance, um, and insects might have specific calls. But in plants, it's often the reproductive isolation has to do with flowering. And so your book goes through a nice example of squirrel corn and Dutchman breeches, two extremely similar plants, extremely closely related, but their flowering times do not overlap. And so squirrel corn and Dutchman's breeches, even growing in the same habitat, can't interbreed because the flowers develop at different times. So it's a good example of somehow they were separated and they developed this different timing. And when they came back together, that didn't matter. They weren't going to interbreed. Okay, the second question is how the timing of these things. How fast does the evolution happen? And is the process random? Does it happen fast or slow? And this is a hard question to answer if you just study continents, but you can look at special places where there have been lots of species developing quickly. And so you have these closely related species that evolved from a common ancestor occurring in different parts of the environment. These are sometimes called adaptive radiations, and they typically occur on islands or after big catastrophes. And so you see stuff like this on the Hawaiian Islands or the Galapagos, or you see them at specific times after there's been really severe disruption to a habitat. A good example are bromeliads. These are found on island species. They're an unusual plant, but in Hawaiian Islands, they're extremely diverse because they were one of the first plants to get there. They're different islands, and so each island developed different species, and different species developed in different parts of the islands. Another example with the Hawaiian Islands are the Silver Swords Alliance. These are an unusual plant that got to the island 5 or 6 million years ago, more diverse in Hawaii than anywhere else in the world. So this can happen when a single population starts to diverge, and you may have, especially like in Hawaii, you have elevations up to 10,000 feet or all the way down to sea level. And so different forms and characteristics are advantageous at different parts of the island. And so you may get selection for divergent body sizes, okay, where, um, in lowland areas, it might be better to be small, and in upland areas, it might be better to be large. So we think these adaptive radiations and character displacements, we think that those led to rapid evolutionary change. Okay. Most times we don't see that though. If you look at mainlands, it's most times things seem to go pretty slowly, that there doesn't seem to be much change. But there do appear to be times when there's lots of change. And so here we have a look at the number of species in different groups. And about 150 million years ago, uh, the cycads and the ferns were extremely abundant. That's Pterophyta ferns. And there were just a few flowering plants, hardly any at all. But after big disruptions to habitats, both 120 million years ago and 60 million years ago, we see that there was a, a decrease in the number of species, and the flowering plants, which are the angiosperms, became much more abundant. So this is we talk about mass extinctions, and these lead to adaptive radiations. And so, whoops, I went backwards here. So speciation through time generally has surpassed extinction, but these mass extinctions are times when there's more extinctions than there are species. Um, and some of these have been really severe, and we have an idea of what happened for some of them, but not others. Like the Cretaceous, we know that's when the dinosaurs went extinct. It's related to a large asteroid impact that uh, produced ash that can be found in sediments worldwide. Um, so that produced the end of the dinosaurs and is one of the 5 mass extinctions, but often these are followed by adaptive radiations. And so these are times when we see these adaptive radiations occur after these extinction events and lead to large numbers of new species. Okay, so speciation. We think that lots of these things happen before mating, like in geographic isolation or ecological isolation, but that some happen after mating. But that's how we believe new species form. We see this often on islands and in new habitats, but we think in large areas, mostly it's happening very, very slowly.